Some stories are written in stone and steel. They are tales of ambition, of humanity taming nature, of monuments built to last an eternity. We look at these creations and see the genius of their architect. But what happens when the genius is wrong? What happens when the monument of a lifetime becomes the tombstone for hundreds? This is the story of a dam, born from the mind of a titan, meant to be the crowning achievement of a career that gave life to a desert city. And it's the story of the terrifying moment, just before midnight, when that monument disintegrated, unleashing a 12 billion-gallon wall of death that erased entire communities from the map. Before we uncover this largely forgotten catastrophe, we invite you to consider a question: what is the line between bold confidence and fatal hubris? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Act 1: The Titan and His Monument. To understand the disaster that would claim over 400 lives and destroy thousands of acres of California's most fertile land, you must first understand the miracle that is Los Angeles. A sprawling metropolis rising from the middle of a semi-arid desert, a city that by all logic should not exist on such a scale. Yet there it stands, a testament to human ambition and engineering prowess. It exists for one reason above all others: water. And that water exists because of one man, William Mulholland. But William Mulholland was not born to greatness. His story began not in the halls of engineering schools or the boardrooms of power, but in the poverty-stricken streets of Belfast, Ireland, on September 11, 1855. Born to Hugh and Ellen Mulholland, working-class Dubliners who had moved to Belfast in search of better opportunities, young William's early life was marked by tragedy and hardship that would forge the iron determination that would later reshape the American West. When William was just 7 years old, his mother Ellen died, leaving his father Hugh to raise him and his younger brother alone. 3 years later, Hugh remarried, but the family dynamics remained strained. William struggled in school, and his relationship with his father was tumultuous. After one particularly severe beating for poor grades, the 10-year-old boy made a decision that would change the course of his life forever. He ran away to sea. At the age of 15, William Mulholland joined the British Merchant Navy, serving aboard the ship Blennifer and making at least 19 Atlantic crossings to ports throughout North America and the Caribbean. For 4 years, he lived the hard life of a merchant seaman, learning discipline, self-reliance, and the value of practical knowledge over formal education. These lessons would serve him well in the years to come. In 1874, at the age of 19, Mulholland disembarked in New York City and began his journey into the American interior. He worked his way west, laboring first on Great Lakes freighters during the summer months and in lumber camps during the harsh Michigan winters. It was dangerous work that nearly cost him his life when a logging accident almost resulted in the amputation of his leg. After recovering from his injuries, Mulholland continued his westward migration, working as a handyman in Ohio before reconnecting with his brother Hugh. In December 1876, the two brothers made a fateful decision that would bring William to his destiny. They stowed away on a ship bound for California, hiding in the cargo hold as the vessel made its way through the Panama Canal. When they were discovered in Panama, the brothers were forced to leave the ship and walk 47 miles through dense jungle to reach Balboa on the Pacific side. It was a grueling journey that tested every ounce of determination they possessed, but it brought them to the ship that would carry them to California and to the future that awaited them there. William Mulholland arrived in Los Angeles in 1877, a 22-year-old Irish immigrant with calloused hands, a sharp mind, and an unquenchable thirst for knowledge. The Los Angeles he found was a far cry from the sprawling metropolis it would become. It was a dusty frontier town of barely 9,000 residents, sustained by a single, unreliable river that meandered through the desert landscape. The Los Angeles River was the lifeline that had attracted the Spanish explorers who founded the Pueblo in 1769, and it remained the primary source of water for the growing community. But even in 1877, forward-thinking residents understood that the river alone would never be sufficient to support the kind of growth that the city's boosters envisioned for their community. Mulholland's first job in Los Angeles was as a lowly ditch tender for the Los Angeles City Water Company, a private corporation that had been granted the right to distribute water from the Los Angeles River to the city's residents and businesses. It was menial work that paid $1.50 per day, but it gave Mulholland his first exposure to the complex engineering challenges involved in water distribution and management. The job of a ditch tender involved maintaining the network of open channels and primitive pipes that carried water from the river to various parts of the city. It required understanding of hydraulics, mathematics, and engineering principles that Mulholland had never formally studied. But rather than being discouraged by his lack of formal education, he threw himself into learning everything he could about water systems. Mulholland became a voracious autodidact, spending his meager wages on engineering textbooks and technical manuals that he studied by candlelight in his modest lodgings. He learned mathematics, hydraulics, geology, and engineering principles through sheer force of will and intellectual curiosity. His supervisors quickly recognized his exceptional abilities and began promoting him through the ranks of the water company. By 1886, just 9 years after arriving in Los Angeles as a penniless immigrant, William Mulholland had been promoted to superintendent of the Los Angeles City Water Company. It was an extraordinary rise that reflected both his technical competence and his natural leadership abilities. More importantly, it put him in a position to influence the future development of water resources in Los Angeles at a critical moment in the city's history. The 1880s and 1890s were a period of rapid growth for Los Angeles, as the completion of transcontinental railroads brought new waves of settlers seeking opportunities in the mild climate and growing economy of Southern California. The city's population doubled from 50,000 in 1890 to more than 100,000 in 1900, and civic leaders were already dreaming of even more dramatic expansion. However, this growth was constrained by the fundamental limitation of water supply. The Los Angeles River was notoriously unreliable, flowing strongly during wet years but reduced to a trickle during periodic droughts. The rivers flow varied dramatically with seasonal rainfall, and there were years when it nearly dried up completely, threatening the survival of the entire community. Mulholland understood better than anyone that Los Angeles would never achieve its potential as long as it remained dependent on the capricious Los Angeles River. He began studying regional geography and climate patterns, looking for alternative sources of water that could provide the reliable supply necessary to support continued growth. His attention was drawn to the Owens Valley, a long, narrow valley on the eastern side of the Sierra Nevada mountains, more than 200 miles northeast of Los Angeles. The valley was fed by snowmelt from some of the highest peaks in the continental United States, creating a year-round water supply that dwarfed anything available in Southern California. The Owens River, which flowed through the valley, carried more than enough water to supply all of Los Angeles's needs for decades to come. But the challenge of transporting that water across more than 200 miles of desert and mountains seemed almost insurmountable. The engineering obstacles were enormous, the costs would be staggering, and the political complications were daunting. But Mulholland was not deterred by seemingly impossible challenges. He had already proven his ability to solve complex engineering problems, and he was convinced that the technical obstacles could be overcome with sufficient determination and resources. What he needed was political support and financial backing for what would become one of the most ambitious municipal engineering projects in American history. The key to securing that support was Frederick Eaton, a former mayor of Los Angeles who shared Mulholland's vision of a much larger and more prosperous city. Eaton had worked with Mulholland in the private water company during the 1880s, and the two men had developed both a professional partnership and a personal friendship based on their shared ambitions for Los Angeles. When Eaton was elected mayor in 1898, He was in a position to champion Mulholland's vision for bringing Owens Valley water to Los Angeles. However, the project they were contemplating would require not just engineering expertise, but also political maneuvering and financial manipulation that would prove controversial for decades to come. The plan that Mulholland and Eaton developed was audacious in its scope and ruthless in its execution. They would secretly acquire water rights throughout the Owens Valley, using intermediaries and shell companies to disguise Los Angeles's involvement in the purchases. At the same time, they would lobby federal authorities to block competing development projects that might interfere with their plans. The secrecy was necessary because residents of the Owens Valley would never voluntarily sell their water rights if they knew the true purpose of the purchases. The valley was home to thousands of farmers, ranchers, and small-town residents whose livelihoods depended on reliable access to irrigation water. Losing that water to Los Angeles would mean economic devastation for the entire region. Between 1902 and 1905, Eaton and his associates systematically acquired water rights and property throughout the Owens Valley, often paying far above market value to ensure rapid sales. The sellers were told that the land would be used for agricultural development, not that their water would be diverted to Los Angeles. Meanwhile, Mulholland was working on the technical challenges of designing and building what would become known as the Los Angeles Aqueduct. The system would have to carry water across 233 miles of some of the most challenging terrain in North America, including high mountain passes, deep desert valleys, and earthquake-prone geological formations. The aqueduct would be a gravity-fed system, meaning that water would flow from the Owens Valley to Los Angeles without the need for pumping stations or external power sources. This would require precise engineering to ensure the proper gradient over the entire length of the system, taking into account elevation changes, geological obstacles, and the need to maintain sufficient flow rates. The project would require the construction of 164 separate tunnels through mountain ridges, dozens of concrete-lined channels across desert valleys, and hundreds of miles of steel pipes to carry water over and around obstacles. It would be the longest aqueduct in the world at the time of its completion, and one of the most technically challenging engineering projects ever undertaken by a municipal government. In 1907, after years of planning and preparation, construction of the Los Angeles Aqueduct finally began. Mulholland was appointed chief engineer for the project, with full responsibility for overseeing every aspect of the massive undertaking. At its peak, the project employed nearly 4,000 workers laboring in some of the most remote and harsh conditions imaginable. The construction crews included engineers, surveyors, miners, concrete workers, pipe fitters, teamsters, and laborers representing dozens of different trades and nationalities. Many were recent immigrants who had come to America seeking economic opportunities, and the aqueduct project provided steady employment at wages that were considered generous by the standards of the time. However, the work was dangerous and demanding. The crews labored in temperatures that regularly exceeded 110 degrees Fahrenheit in the summer and dropped below freezing in the winter. They worked with primitive equipment and explosives to blast tunnels through solid rock, often risking cave-ins, explosions, and other industrial accidents. Despite these challenges, the project proceeded remarkably smoothly under Mulholland's leadership. He demonstrated exceptional organizational skills and technical competence, solving engineering problems as they arose and maintaining morale among the workforce despite the harsh working conditions. The aqueduct was completed in 1913, 6 months ahead of schedule and under budget. The final cost was $24.5 million, funded entirely through municipal bonds approved by Los Angeles voters who had been convinced that the project was essential for the city's future prosperity. The opening ceremony for the Los Angeles Aqueduct took place on November 5, 1913, in the San Fernando Valley, where water from the Owens River would flow into local reservoirs and distribution systems. Thousands of Los Angeles residents gathered to witness the historic moment when their city would finally have access to a reliable, abundant water supply. When the gates were opened and water began cascading down the spillway into the San Fernando Valley, William Mulholland was called upon to address the crowd. The man who had spent 6 years overseeing one of the most challenging engineering projects in American history chose to mark the moment with characteristic brevity and directness. "There it is," he said, gesturing toward the flowing water. "Take it." Those 5 words became legendary in Los Angeles history, symbolizing both Mulholland's practical approach to engineering challenges and the city's determination to secure the resources necessary for continued growth. The success of the Aqueduct project established Mulholland as a genuine hero in Los Angeles, the man who had made it possible for the city to grow from a dusty frontier town into a major metropolitan area. The immediate impact of the aqueduct was dramatic. With access to abundant, reliable water from the Owens Valley, Los Angeles was able to support residential and commercial development on a scale that had been impossible with the limited flow of the Los Angeles River. The city's population tripled to nearly 320,000 by 1910 and continued growing rapidly throughout the following decades. The San Fernando Valley, which had been largely agricultural before the arrival of aqueduct water, was gradually transformed into suburban residential neighborhoods that housed hundreds of thousands of new residents. Real estate developers made fortunes by subdividing former farmland into residential lots, and the economic boom generated by population growth created opportunities in construction, manufacturing, and services. However, the success of the aqueduct also created new challenges for Mulholland and the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power, which had been established in 1902 when the city took control of the former private water company. The rapid growth in population and economic activity increased demand for water beyond what had been originally projected, and periodic droughts in the Owens Valley raised concerns about the long-term reliability of the system. By the early 1920s, Mulholland was convinced that Los Angeles needed additional water storage capacity to ensure reliable supply during dry years and to provide reserve capacity for continued population growth. The aqueduct could deliver large quantities of water to the city, but it provided no means of storing water for use during periods when demand exceeded the flow capacity of the system. The solution, Mulholland believed, was to build a large reservoir that could store a year's worth of water for the entire city. This reservoir would serve as insurance against drought, equipment failures, or other disruptions to the aqueduct system, ensuring that Los Angeles would never again face the kind of water shortages that had constrained its growth in earlier decades. The site that Mulholland selected for this crucial reservoir was San Francisco Canyon, a narrow gorge in the mountains about 40 miles northwest of Los Angeles. The canyon was ideally situated to receive water from the aqueduct and to distribute it to the city's growing distribution system. More importantly, the narrow opening of the canyon could be closed with a relatively modest dam that would create a large reservoir in the wider sections of the canyon behind it. The dam that Mulholland designed for San Francisco Canyon would be a concrete gravity dam, a type of structure that relies on the weight of concrete and the strength of its foundation to resist the enormous pressure exerted by millions of gallons of stored water. The design was based on engineering principles that were well understood at the time, and similar dams had been built successfully in other locations. However, the St. Francis Dam, as it came to be known, would be larger and more ambitious than most previous projects of its type. The original design called for a structure 175 feet high and 700 feet long at its crest, creating a reservoir capable of holding approximately 38,000 acre-feet of water, or roughly 12.4 billion gallons. Construction of the St. Francis Dam began in July 1924, with Mulholland personally supervising every aspect of the project. He was 69 years old at the time, but his energy and attention to detail remained as sharp as ever. He visited the construction site regularly, making design modifications as work progressed and ensuring that the finished structure would meet his exacting standards. During construction, Mulholland made two significant modifications to the original design, both aimed at increasing the dam's storage capacity. First, he raised the height of the dam by 10 feet, bringing the total height to 185 feet. Later, he raised it an additional 20 feet to a final height of 205 feet. These modifications increased the reservoir's capacity to approximately 47,000 acre-feet, or more than 15 billion gallons. The decision to raise the height of the dam during construction was typical of Mulholland's approach to engineering challenges. He was always looking for ways to maximize the efficiency and capacity of his projects, and he was confident in his ability to make design modifications based on his extensive experience and engineering judgment. However, the modifications to the St. Francis Dam were made without the kind of comprehensive engineering review and geological analysis that would be standard practice for similar projects today. Mulholland was operating under the engineering standards and practices of the 1920s, when dam design was considered more of an art than a science and when individual engineers were expected to rely heavily on their personal judgment and experience. The foundation for the St. Francis Dam was excavated directly into the rocky walls and floor of San Francisco Canyon, with engineers assuming that the solid rock would provide adequate support for the massive concrete structure. Geological surveys of the site were limited by the technology and understanding available at the time, and potential problems with the foundation rock were not identified during the design and construction process. The dam was completed in May 1926, and the reservoir began filling immediately as water from the Los Angeles Aqueduct was diverted into San Francisco Canyon. For Mulholland, the completion of the St. Francis Dam represented the crowning achievement of his career, the final piece in the water supply system that had transformed Los Angeles from a small frontier town into one of the largest cities in the United States. The St. Francis Dam was not just an engineering project for Mulholland, it was a symbol of his life's work and his contribution to the growth and prosperity of Los Angeles. He had devoted more than 40 years to building the water infrastructure that made the city's expansion possible, and the dam represented the culmination of all his efforts and expertise. For nearly 2 years after its completion, the St. Francis Dam operated exactly as Mulholland had designed it to operate. Water from the aqueduct flowed into the reservoir during periods of high flow, and stored water was released to the city's distribution system during periods of high demand. The system worked flawlessly, providing Los Angeles with the kind of reliable water supply that Mulholland had envisioned since his early days as a ditch tender. However, by early 1928, the reservoir was filled to capacity for the first time since the dam's completion. The winter of 1927-28 had been unusually wet, and heavy snowfall in the Sierra Nevada had created high flows in the Owens River that filled the reservoir to its maximum level of 38,168 acre-feet. It was then, with the dam holding back more than 12 billion gallons of water, that troubling signs began to appear. Small cracks appeared in the concrete face of the dam, and seepage was observed at several locations around the structure. Most concerning was a leak of muddy water from the western abutment of the dam, where the concrete structure met the natural rock of the canyon wall. These signs of potential distress should have been cause for immediate concern and comprehensive investigation. However, Mulholland's confidence in his creation was absolute, and he dismissed the warning signs as normal phenomena that occurred in all large dams. He attributed the muddy seepage to natural runoff from the saturated hillsides above the reservoir, and he believed that the cracks in the concrete were simply the result of thermal expansion and contraction. On the morning of March 12, 1928, dam keeper Tony Harnischfeger, who lived with his family in a small cottage just below the dam, called Mulholland to report his concerns about the increasing seepage and the appearance of new cracks in the structure. Harnischfeger was an experienced man who had worked around dams for many years, and he was genuinely worried about what he was observing. Mulholland, now 72 years old but still vigorous and sharp, drove out to San Francisco Canyon that afternoon with his assistant, Harvey Van Norman, to conduct a personal inspection of the dam. He spent more than 2 hours examining every aspect of the structure, looking at the cracks, investigating the seepage, and assessing the overall condition of his masterpiece. After completing his inspection, Mulholland reached the conclusion that would seal the fate of hundreds of innocent people. Despite the warning signs that were clearly visible to anyone who looked carefully, he declared that the St. Francis Dam was safe and that the problems Harnischfeger had observed were normal and temporary. His professional judgment, based on more than 4 decades of experience in water engineering, was that his dam would continue to perform exactly as he had designed it to perform. It was a fatal miscalculation that would end his career, destroy his reputation, and cost the lives of more than 400 people who were sleeping peacefully in the valley below. As Mulholland drove away from the St. Francis Dam for the last time on the afternoon of March 12, 1928, he had no idea that he was leaving behind a ticking time bomb that would detonate in less than 12 hours. The man who had been hailed as the engineering genius who gave life to Los Angeles was about to become responsible for one of the worst civil engineering disasters in American history. The monument that was supposed to secure his legacy was about to become his tombstone, and the water that had made him famous was about to become an instrument of death and destruction on an unimaginable scale. Act 2, The Wall of Death. The night of March 12, 1928, began quietly in the San Francisco Canyon and the Santa Clara River Valley below. It was a cool, clear evening with a gentle breeze drifting through the valley, carrying the sense of spring wildflowers and freshly irrigated farmland. In the small communities scattered throughout the region, families were settling down for the night, unaware that they were living through their final hours. Tony Harnischfeger, the dam keeper, was in his modest cottage just 1,200 feet below the St. Francis Dam with his wife Leona and their 6-year-old son Coder. The family had been living at the dam site since its completion in 1926, and Tony took pride in his responsibility for monitoring and maintaining the massive structure that loomed above their home. Despite William Mulholland's reassurances earlier that day, Tony remained uneasy about the signs of distress he had been observing in the dam. The muddy seepage from the western abutment had continued throughout the day, and he had noticed additional hairline cracks appearing in the concrete face of the structure. But Mulholland was the chief engineer, the man who had built Los Angeles's entire water system, and if he said the dam was safe, then it must be safe. For miles downstream from the dam, at Powerhouse Number 2, 67 workers and their families were asleep in the small community that had grown up around the electrical generating facility. The powerhouse was part of the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power's hydroelectric system, using water from the aqueduct to generate electricity for the growing city. It was a close-knit community where everyone knew everyone else, and where the sound of rushing water through the generating turbines provided a constant background hum that residents had long since learned to ignore. The powerhouse workers included engineers, turbine operators, maintenance technicians, and their families, representing a cross-section of skilled working-class families who had found steady employment and a good life in the remote canyon. Their children attended a small school nearby, and the community had its own recreation facilities and social organizations that created a sense of belonging and security. Further downstream, in the broader expanse of the Santa Clara River Valley, thousands of additional families were sleeping in small towns and agricultural communities that depended on the fertile soil and reliable water supply of the river valley for their livelihoods. The valley was one of California's most productive agricultural regions, supporting extensive cultivation of citrus fruits, vegetables, and field crops that fed much of Southern California. Many of the agricultural workers in the valley were seasonal migrants who followed the harvest cycles throughout California, living in temporary camps and working for wages that were low but steady. These workers included recent immigrants from Mexico who had come north seeking economic opportunities, as well as American families who had been displaced by economic hardship in other parts of the country. The migrant workers were among the most vulnerable residents of the valley, as they often lived in substandard housing, lacked access to adequate medical care and education, and had little political influence or social protection. Many of them were undocumented immigrants who lived in constant fear of deportation and who avoided contact with government authorities whenever possible. As midnight approached on March 12, 1928, all of these people were sleeping peacefully, secure in their assumption that the massive concrete dam upstream was protecting rather than threatening their lives. None of them had any warning of what was about to happen, and few would have time to react when the wall of death came roaring down the canyon toward them. At exactly 2.5 minutes before midnight, 11:57 and 30 seconds p.m., the St. Francis Dam ceased to exist. There were no surviving eyewitnesses to the initial moment of catastrophic failure, but the last person to see the dam intact was Ace Hopewell, a carpenter at Powerhouse No. 1 who had ridden his motorcycle past the structure about 10 minutes before midnight. Hopewell later testified at the coroner's inquest that he had noticed nothing unusual about the dam or the powerhouse as he rode past, but that he had heard a strange rumbling sound about 1.5 miles upstream from the dam. The rumbling sounded like rocks rolling down the hillside, and Hopewell had stopped his motorcycle to investigate. He dismounted, lit a cigarette, and listened carefully to determine the source of the noise. The sound seemed to be fading, and he assumed it was just another of the small landslides that were common in the area during wet weather. After finishing his cigarette, he remounted his motorcycle and continued on his way, unaware that he had just witnessed the beginning of the geological failure that would destroy the dam. The collapse of the St. Francis Dam was not a simple structural failure, but a complex sequence of events that involved both the dam itself and the geological formation on which it was built. Modern analysis of the disaster has revealed that the dam was constructed on an ancient landslide zone that had been reactivated by the weight and water pressure of the reservoir. The western abutment of the dam, where Tony Harnischfeger had observed the most troubling seepage, was built on a formation called the Sespe Conglomerate, a geological structure that appeared solid but actually contained weaknesses that made it unsuitable for supporting a major dam. When the reservoir was filled to capacity for the first time, the increased water pressure penetrated into these geological weaknesses and began to destabilize the entire formation. At the same time, uplift pressure from groundwater beneath the dam was exerting tremendous force on the concrete structure itself. The dam had not been designed to withstand the full uplift pressure that could be generated when the reservoir was filled to capacity, and this pressure was gradually weakening the foundation and creating stress fractures throughout the structure. The actual failure sequence began sometime after 11:30 p.m., when the water level in the reservoir dropped approximately 3.6 inches over the course of 23 minutes. This indicated that water was escaping from the reservoir at an increasing rate, probably through cracks and fissures that were developing in both the dam and its foundation. The failure accelerated rapidly as the structural integrity of the dam deteriorated. The eastern end of the structure, undermined by geological instability, lost its support from the canyon wall and began to tilt outward under the enormous pressure of the water behind it. This tilting created additional stress on the western end of the dam, which was already weakened by the geological problems in the Sespe Conglomerate. At 11:57 and 30 seconds p.m., instruments at power stations in Los Angeles recorded a sudden voltage drop that indicated the failure of electrical transmission lines in San Francisco Canyon. Simultaneously, a transformer at Southern California Edison's Saugus substation exploded when power lines along the western canyon wall were severed by the collapsing dam structure. What happened next was a catastrophic disintegration that destroyed the entire 700-foot length of the St. Francis Dam in less than 1 minute. The massive concrete structure, which had taken 2 years to build and which Mulholland had expected to last for centuries, was obliterated by forces that no one had anticipated and that no one could control. The collapse released 12.4 billion gallons of water in what witnesses described as a wall of death that was initially 140 feet high and 1,200 feet wide. The first wave carried with it enormous chunks of concrete from the dam itself, some weighing more than 10,000 tons, which were swept downstream like pebbles by the incredible force of the moving water. Tony Harnischfeger, his wife Leona, and their 6-year-old son Coder were the first victims of the disaster. Their cottage, located just 1,200 feet below the dam, was completely destroyed by the initial wall of water, and all 3 family members were killed instantly. Their bodies were never recovered, swept away in the torrent and deposited somewhere in the 54 miles of devastation that would follow. The flood wave, moving at an initial speed of 18 miles per hour, slammed into powerhouse number 2 just 5 minutes after the dam collapsed. The powerhouse was a substantial concrete structure that had been designed to withstand the normal forces of water and weather, but it was no match for the incredible power of 12 billion gallons of water moving at high speed. The building was completely destroyed, leaving only 2 twisted turbines as evidence that a thriving community had existed there just minutes before. Of the 67 workers and family members who lived near the powerhouse, 64 were killed instantly. Only 3 people survived, including a woman who was swept downstream and managed to climb onto debris, and 2 men who happened to be on high ground when the wave struck. The stories of the powerhouse victims illustrate the random nature of survival and death during the disaster. Lyman Curtis, a powerhouse worker, noticed a strange mist in the air and realized that something was wrong just moments before the flood arrived. He sent his wife Lillian and son Danny to high ground while he went back into the house to retrieve his 2 daughters, Marjorie and Maisie. Lillian and Danny survived, but Lyman and the 2 girls were swept away and killed. From powerhouse number 2, the flood wave continued its destructive journey down San Francisco Canyon toward the broader Santa Clara River Valley. The water was no longer just water, it had become a thick, grinding slurry of mud, rocks, trees, concrete debris, railroad tracks, and the broken remnants of human lives. The flood had picked up everything in its path and transformed it into a devastating mixture that would scour the landscape down to bedrock. As the flood entered the Santa Clara River Valley, it encountered its first major population center, a large construction camp belonging to the Southern California Edison Company. The camp housed approximately 150 workers who were building power transmission lines through the valley, and it was located on what appeared to be safe ground along the riverbank. However, the flood wave was far larger and more powerful than anyone had imagined possible. When it struck the construction camp at approximately 1 a.m., 84 of the 150 workers were killed, many of them swept from their beds as their temporary housing was destroyed by the rushing water. The survivors included men who happened to be working the night shift or who were lucky enough to be sleeping in buildings on slightly higher ground. The destruction of the Edison camp marked the beginning of the flood's assault on the agricultural communities of the Santa Clara River Valley. As the wave spread out across the broader valley floor, it began to impact the small towns and farming communities that had been built along the fertile riverbanks over the previous several decades. One of the most heroic aspects of the disaster was the role played by telephone operators, particularly the young women known as Hello Girls who worked the night shift at telephone exchanges throughout the valley. These operators stayed at their switchboards as the flood approached, making call after call to warn downstream communities of the approaching danger. The telephone operators became the Paul Reveres of the St. Francis Dam disaster, sacrificing their own chances of escape to warn as many people as possible about the approaching flood. Many of them continued working until the rising water forced them to abandon their posts, and several were killed when their exchanges were destroyed by the flood. In Santa Paula, one of the larger towns in the path of the flood, Telephone operator Louise Guy received word from upstream that the dam had collapsed and immediately began calling every number in her directory to warn residents. She continued making calls until the flood water reached her building, then climbed to the second floor and continued her work until the building itself was swept away. She was rescued from the roof of a house miles downstream and survived to tell her story. The communities in the path of the flood had varying amounts of warning and different opportunities for survival. Towns closer to the dam had less warning but often had higher ground available for refuge. Communities further downstream had more time to react but were often located in flat areas where escape was more difficult. Castaic Junction, a small railroad town located about 25 miles downstream from the dam, was almost completely destroyed when the flood arrived at approximately 2 a.m. The town's residents had received some warning from upstream, but many had not believed that the danger was real or had not understood the magnitude of what was approaching them. The flood destroyed the railroad depot, several business buildings, and most of the residential structures in the town. Bodies and debris from Castaic Junction were found scattered across miles of the Santa Clara River Valley, and some were never recovered at all. Fillmore, a larger agricultural town further downstream, had more warning and was able to evacuate many of its residents to higher ground before the flood arrived. However, the town still suffered significant damage, and several residents were killed when they were caught in areas that had seemed safe but were actually within the flood's reach. The town of Santa Paula, located about 45 miles downstream from the dam site, was struck by the flood at approximately 3 a.m. By this time, the flood had spread out across a front more than a mile wide, and the water was 25 feet deep in some areas. However, the advance warning provided by the telephone operators and other communication systems had allowed many residents to evacuate to safety. Santa Paula's business district was devastated by the flood, with dozens of buildings destroyed or severely damaged. However, the death toll in the town was relatively low compared to communities closer to the dam, largely because of the warning system that had been established and the availability of higher ground for evacuation. As the flood continued toward the Pacific Ocean, it carried with it a grim cargo of human remains, destroyed buildings, agricultural equipment, livestock, and personal belongings that represented the shattered lives of hundreds of families. The muddy water had picked up soil from thousands of acres of farmland, creating a thick, viscous mixture that was difficult to see through and almost impossible to escape from once someone was caught in it. The flood finally reached the Pacific Ocean at approximately 5:30 a.m. on March 13, 1928, near the town of Ventura. By this time, the water had spread across the broad Oxnard Plain, depositing debris and bodies across thousands of acres of some of California's most valuable agricultural land. The Pacific Ocean itself was discolored for miles offshore by the muddy water and debris from the flood. Bodies, pieces of buildings, and other debris continued to wash ashore for weeks after the disaster, and some remains were found as far south as the Mexican border. As the sun rose on March 13, 1928, it revealed a scene of devastation that was almost impossible to comprehend. The fertile Santa Clara River Valley, which had been one of California's most productive agricultural regions just hours before, had been transformed into a desolate wasteland of mud, debris, and death. More than 1,200 homes had been destroyed, along with dozens of businesses, schools, churches, and public buildings. Thousands of acres of orchards and farmland had been scoured away, leaving behind only bare earth and scattered debris. Miles of railroad track had been twisted and buried, and numerous bridges and roads had been washed away completely. But the physical destruction, as devastating as it was, could not compare to the human cost of the disaster. Bodies were scattered across 54 miles of the flood path, many buried under tons of mud and debris. Entire families had been wiped out, leaving no survivors to even report their deaths. The official death toll would eventually be set at more than 400, but the true number was almost certainly higher. Many of the victims were migrant workers who had been living in temporary camps along the river. These workers were often undocumented immigrants whose presence in the United States was not officially recorded, making it impossible to determine how many had been killed or to notify their families in Mexico and other countries. The racial and economic dimensions of the disaster would become one of its most tragic aspects. While wealthy residents of the valley often had sufficient warning and transportation to escape to safety, poor farm workers and their families were more likely to be caught in the flood and killed. The victims included entire families of Mexican immigrants who had come north seeking better lives for their children. The immediate aftermath of the disaster was chaos as rescue workers struggled to reach survivors and recover bodies from the sea of mud that covered much of the valley. The American Red Cross mobilized hundreds of volunteers and established emergency shelters, medical stations, and morgues to deal with the unprecedented scale of the catastrophe. However, the rescue efforts were hampered by the condition of the flood zone, where mud up to 70 feet deep had covered roads, landmarks, and even entire buildings. Rescuers had to use boats to navigate areas that had been dry land just hours before, and they often had to dig through layers of mud and debris to reach victims who had been buried alive. The search for bodies would continue for months after the disaster, with remains being discovered as the mud gradually dried and shifted. The last confirmed victim of the St. Francis Dam disaster was not found until 1992, when construction workers discovered human remains while excavating near Newhall, more than 60 years after the flood. As news of the disaster spread throughout California and the nation, public attention focused on the man who had been responsible for building and maintaining the dam that had caused such devastation. William Mulholland, the engineering genius who had been hailed as the father of modern Los Angeles, was about to face the most difficult period of his life as he confronted the consequences of his greatest failure. The wall of death that had roared down the Santa Clara River Valley had not only claimed more than 400 lives and destroyed thousands of acres of productive land, it had also destroyed the reputation and career of the man who had devoted his life to bringing water to Los Angeles. The hero who had given life to a desert city was about to become the villain responsible for one of the worst engineering disasters in American history. Act 3: The Reckoning and the Forgotten. The morning light of March 13, 1928, revealed a scene of devastation that defied comprehension. As rescue workers, journalists, and government officials made their way into the Santa Clara River Valley, they encountered a landscape that had been transformed overnight from fertile farmland into a desolate wasteland of mud, debris, and death. The search for survivors began immediately, but it quickly became apparent that this would be primarily a recovery operation rather than a rescue mission. The power of the flood had been so immense and the destruction so complete that few people caught in the direct path of the water had survived. Most of the survivors were people who had received advance warning and had been able to reach high ground, or who had been fortunate enough to be outside the flood zone when the disaster occurred. The American Red Cross mobilized its largest disaster response operation in California history up to that time, establishing emergency shelters, field hospitals, and temporary morgues throughout the affected region. Hundreds of volunteers worked around the clock to provide food, medical care, and basic necessities to the thousands of people who had been left homeless by the flood. However, the scale of the disaster overwhelmed even these extensive relief efforts. The mud was so deep and viscous that rescue workers often had to use boats to navigate areas that had been dry land just hours before. Bodies and survivors were scattered across more than 50 miles of devastation, making it difficult to coordinate search and rescue operations effectively. The condition of the flood zone also created serious public health concerns. The mixture of mud, debris, and human remains created ideal conditions for the spread of disease, and authorities were forced to implement emergency sanitation measures to prevent outbreaks of typhoid, cholera, and other waterborne illnesses. One of the most heartbreaking aspects of the disaster was the difficulty of identifying victims and notifying their families. Many bodies were so damaged by the flood that identification was impossible, and the extensive mixing of debris from different communities meant their remains were often found miles from where victims had lived. The problem was particularly acute for the migrant farm worker families who made up a significant portion of the victims. Many of these families were undocumented immigrants who had been living under assumed names or who had no official records of their presence in the United States. Their deaths went unrecorded in official statistics, and their families in Mexico and other countries were never notified of their fate. As the scope of the disaster became clear, public attention increasingly focused on William Mulholland and the decisions that had led to the catastrophic failure of the St. Francis Dam. The man who had been celebrated as a genius just hours before was now facing intense scrutiny and growing accusations that his negligence had caused one of the worst engineering disasters in American history. Mulholland's initial response to news of the dam failure was characteristic of his direct, no-nonsense approach to crisis management. He immediately traveled to the disaster site to assess the damage and to begin the process of understanding what had gone wrong. What he found there shook him to his core and marked the beginning of his transformation from public hero to tragic figure. The complete destruction of the dam itself was shocking enough, but the scale of human suffering that his creation had caused was almost unbearable for a man who had devoted his career to improving the lives of Los Angeles residents. As he walked through the ruins of communities that had been wiped off the map, Mulholland began to grasp the full magnitude of the tragedy for which he bore ultimate responsibility. The political response to the disaster was swift and unforgiving. California Governor C.C. Young immediately ordered a comprehensive investigation into the causes of the dam failure and appointed a commission of engineers and experts to determine whether criminal negligence had been involved. Los Angeles Mayor Georgie Cryer called for a complete review of the city's water system and dam safety procedures. More ominously for Mulholland, the Ventura County District Attorney announced that he was opening a criminal investigation into the dam failure and would seek murder charges against anyone whose negligence or misconduct had contributed to the disaster. This investigation would focus primarily on Mulholland as the chief engineer responsible for the dam's design and maintenance. The technical investigation into the dam failure began immediately, with teams of engineers, geologists, and other experts examining the remains of the structure and the geological conditions at the dam site. What they found painted a disturbing picture of engineering overconfidence and inadequate safety analysis that had created the conditions for catastrophic failure. The most significant finding was that the St. Francis Dam had been built on geological formations that were fundamentally unsuitable for supporting such a massive structure. The western abutment of the dam had been constructed on the Sespe conglomerate, a geological formation that appeared solid but actually contained ancient landslide zones that were reactivated by the weight and water pressure of the full reservoir. Even more damaging was the discovery that the dam had not been designed to withstand the full range of forces that could be exerted on such a structure. The design had not adequately accounted for uplift pressure from groundwater beneath the dam, and the safety factor built into the structure was far lower than what would be considered acceptable by modern engineering standards. The investigation also revealed that the dam had been constructed without the kind of independent engineering review that would be standard practice for similar projects today. Mulholland had designed the dam based on his own experience and judgment, without seeking external validation of his calculations or design assumptions. This approach reflected the engineering practices of the 1920s, but it also meant that potential problems had not been identified and addressed during the design phase. Perhaps most disturbing of all was the revelation that the warning signs observed in the days before the failure should have been recognized as indicators of serious structural problems requiring immediate action. The muddy seepage from the western abutment was actually evidence that the geological foundation was being eroded by water pressure, and the cracks appearing in the concrete were signs of structural stress that exceeded the dam's design limits. The coroner's inquest into the disaster began on March 19, 1928, just 6 days after the dam failure. The proceedings were conducted in the Ventura County Courthouse and attracted intense media attention from throughout the United States and internationally. For many observers, the inquest represented not just an investigation into a specific engineering failure, but a broader examination of the responsibilities and accountability of engineers and other technical professionals. William Mulholland appeared at every session of the inquest, despite the obvious personal toll that the disaster had taken on him. Observers noted that the man who had once radiated confidence and authority now appeared frail and haunted, visibly struggling with the knowledge that his life's work had ended in such tragedy. When Mulholland took the witness stand on March 24, 1928, his testimony was one of the most dramatic and poignant moments in the history of American engineering. Rather than attempting to deflect responsibility or blame others for the disaster, he accepted full accountability for the failure and its consequences. "Don't blame anyone else," he told the packed courtroom. "You just fasten it on me. If there was an error in human judgment, I was the human. I built that dam between sunrise and sunset. I built it and it killed those people." His words, spoken with obvious anguish and remorse, marked one of the most complete and devastating acceptances of personal responsibility by any public figure in American history. Mulholland was not merely acknowledging technical errors or design flaws, he was accepting moral responsibility for the deaths of more than 400 people and the destruction of entire communities. The coroner's jury ultimately cleared Mulholland of criminal responsibility for the disaster, concluding that while the dam failure had been caused by errors in engineering judgment, these errors did not constitute criminal negligence under the legal standards of the time. However, the jury's verdict also included a finding that the disaster had been caused by the selection of an unsafe geological site for the dam, directly contradicting Mulholland's professional judgment. The legal exoneration provided little comfort for Mulholland personally or professionally. His reputation as an engineering genius was destroyed, and his position as chief of the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power became untenable as public confidence in his leadership evaporated. On November 28, 1928, just 8 months after the disaster, William Mulholland announced his retirement from public service, ending a career that had spanned more than 4 decades and had literally shaped the development of Los Angeles. His resignation statement was brief and dignified, but it could not disguise the fact that his career was ending in disgrace rather than celebration. The departure of Mulholland from the Los Angeles water system marked the end of an era in the city's development. The man who had transformed Los Angeles from a small desert town into a major metropolitan area was gone, replaced by a new generation of engineers and administrators who would operate under much stricter safety protocols and regulatory oversight. However, the legacy of the St. Francis Dam disaster extended far beyond the end of Mulholland's career. The catastrophic failure led directly to the establishment of California's Dam Safety Program, one of the most comprehensive regulatory systems for dam construction and maintenance in the United States. The California Dam Safety Act, passed in 1929, required comprehensive geological and engineering analysis for all new dam projects, mandated regular safety inspections of existing dams, and established state authority to order repairs or even demolition of dams that were found to be unsafe. Similar legislation was adopted in other states, creating a national framework for dam safety that prevented many potential disasters in subsequent decades. The disaster also transformed the engineering profession itself, leading to new emphasis on peer review, safety factors, and geological analysis in dam design. Engineering schools began requiring more extensive coursework in geology and soil mechanics, and professional engineering organizations developed new ethical standards emphasizing public safety over client interests. The financial cost of the disaster was enormous, with the city of Los Angeles ultimately paying more than $15 million in damage claims to families and businesses affected by the flood. This represented one of the largest municipal liability settlements in American history at the time, and it established important legal precedents for government liability in engineering disasters. However, the human cost of the disaster could never be fully calculated or compensated. The official death toll of 431 people almost certainly understated the true number of victims, as many migrant workers and undocumented immigrants who died in the flood were never included in official statistics. Estimates by modern researchers suggest that the actual death toll may have been as high as 600 people. The racial and economic dimensions of the disaster also highlighted broader issues of social justice and inequality that would become increasingly important in American society. The fact that poor and immigrant families were disproportionately represented among the victims reflected the geographic and economic vulnerability of these communities, as they were more likely to live in flood-prone areas and less likely to have adequate warning or transportation to escape. The environmental impact of the disaster was also severe and long-lasting. Thousands of acres of fertile agricultural land were buried under layers of mud and debris, and it took years for much of the affected area to be restored to productive use. The Santa Clara River itself was permanently altered by the flood, with its channel widened and deepened by the enormous volume of water and debris that had flowed through it. In the immediate aftermath of the disaster, Los Angeles faced a water crisis as the city lost the storage capacity that the St. Francis Dam had provided. Emergency measures were implemented to reduce water consumption and to find alternative sources of supply, but the loss of the reservoir created long-term challenges for water management in the growing metropolitan area. The psychological impact of the disaster on Los Angeles and Southern California was also significant. The St. Francis Dam failure shattered public confidence in large-scale engineering projects and raised questions about the wisdom of the rapid development that had characterized the region during the 1920s. For William Mulholland personally, the disaster marked the beginning of 7 years of increasing isolation and despair. He withdrew from public life and spent most of his time at his home in the Hollywood Hills, haunted by memories of the people who had died because of his mistake. Friends and family members reported that Mulholland was tormented by guilt and that he spent hours studying engineering textbooks and technical reports, trying to understand how he had made such a catastrophic error in judgment. He reportedly said that he envied the dead and that he wished he had been killed in the flood rather than surviving to face the consequences of his failure. Mulholland's final years were marked by failing health and increasing mental distress. He died on July 22, 1935, at the age of 79, never having fully recovered from the trauma of the St. Francis Dam disaster. His death certificate listed the cause as a stroke, but those who knew him understood that he had really died of a broken heart. Despite the tragic end to his career, efforts to preserve and honor Mulholland's positive contributions to Los Angeles began almost immediately after his death. Mulholland Drive, the scenic highway that winds through the Hollywood Hills, was named in his honor in 1939, and numerous other streets, buildings, and facilities throughout Los Angeles bear his name. The Los Angeles Department of Water and Power established the Mulholland Memorial Fountain in 1940, featuring an inscription that acknowledges both his achievements and his failures. William Mulholland, 1855 to 1935. Engineer, pioneer, builder. His vision and genius gave water to Southern California and built the city of Los Angeles. However, the site of the St. Francis Dam itself became a very different kind of memorial. The ruins of the dam were partially demolished in 1929 to discourage sightseers and souvenir hunters, but substantial concrete remnants remain scattered throughout San Francisco Canyon as a permanent reminder of the disaster. In recent years, efforts have been made to establish a formal memorial at the dam site to honor the victims of the disaster and to ensure that the lessons of the failure are not forgotten. The St. Francis Dam National Memorial Foundation has worked to preserve the site and to educate the public about the importance of engineering safety and disaster preparedness. The story of the St. Francis Dam disaster has also found its way into popular culture, inspiring novels, documentaries, and even a subplot in the classic film Chinatown, which used the Los Angeles water wars as a backdrop for its story of corruption and power in early 20th century California. However, despite these efforts to preserve the memory of the disaster, the St. Francis Dam failure remains largely unknown to most Americans outside of California. Unlike other engineering disasters such as the Titanic sinking or the Tacoma Narrows Bridge collapse, the St. Francis Dam failure has not achieved the kind of widespread recognition that might help prevent similar tragedies in the future. This relative obscurity reflects both the geographic isolation of the disaster and the deliberate efforts by Los Angeles civic leaders to downplay the tragedy and move beyond its negative impact on the city's reputation. The disaster occurred during the height of California's booster era, when civic leaders were working to attract new residents and businesses to the state, and publicity about engineering failures was seen as counterproductive to these efforts. The onset of the Great Depression just 1 year after the disaster also shifted national attention away from what was seen as a local tragedy and toward the much larger economic crisis that was affecting the entire country. The story of the St. Francis Dam failure became a footnote in California history rather than a major chapter in the national narrative. Today, more than 95 years after the disaster, the ruins of the St. Francis Dam remain in San Francisco Canyon as silent witnesses to one of the worst engineering failures in American history. The massive concrete blocks, some weighing thousands of tons, were scattered across miles of the canyon by the force of the flood and have remained largely undisturbed since the disaster. The site serves as a powerful reminder of both the potential benefits and the inherent risks of large-scale engineering projects. The same ambition and technical skill that enabled the construction of the Los Angeles Aqueduct and the development of modern Los Angeles also created the conditions for the catastrophic failure that killed more than 400 people and devastated thousands of acres of productive land. The lessons of the St. Francis Dam disaster remain relevant today as engineers and policymakers grapple with aging infrastructure, climate change, and the challenges of providing essential services to growing populations. The disaster demonstrated that engineering failures can have consequences that extend far beyond technical considerations to affect entire communities and regions. Most importantly, the story of William Mulholland and the St. Francis Dam serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of overconfidence and the importance of humility in the face of natural forces that are not fully understood. The genius who built Los Angeles was ultimately brought down by his failure to recognize the limits of his own knowledge and the inherent uncertainties involved in large-scale engineering projects. The wall of death that roared down the Santa Clara River Valley on March 13, 1928, took with it not only the lives of more than 400 innocent people, but also the reputation of the man who had devoted his life to building the infrastructure that made modern Los Angeles possible. It stands as a permanent reminder that the grandest of human ambitions can fail, that genius is not infallible, and that the price of progress is sometimes paid in the currency of forgotten lives. This was the story of the dam built by a genius, and the wall of death it unleashed. Many people, even in California, have never heard the full story of this incredible tragedy. We are curious to know in the comments, where are you watching from? And is there a major historical event from your region that you feel has been forgotten by time? If you believe these stories must be told, subscribe to Don't Forget About Us and join our mission to ensure they are never lost to history. And don't go anywhere. Please watch our next video, already recommended for you on your screen, about another mystery that history has tried to forget.